The bell above the shop door rang with its familiar delay, a softened sound that no longer invited comment. Heat had settled over the town early, as it often did by late May, arriving before dawn and refusing to lift. In the final week of May 1943, the mornings offered no real reprieve. Even at 8 o'clock, the light already carried the bleached, thinned quality of the high desert as it tipped toward summer. By noon, the main road became a narrow band of glare between low buildings whose shallow shadows failed to offer relief. The store stood where the paved highway narrowed as it entered town, a squat, whitewashed adobe structure with a shallow frontage and a canvas awning stamped with the name of a wholesale distributor based beyond the state line. Locals called it Miller's, a habit that had outlasted the ownership itself. Daniel Miller had never owned the building or its stock. He was the assigned clerk, responsible for opening and closing the door, receiving deliveries, recording sales, and producing figures that traveled outward, to county offices, to company headquarters, to places where the town existed only as a column in a report. Daniel left home before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, walking through the brief interval when the air still held a trace of night. He passed fenced yards of packed earth and scattered mesquite, then the shuttered gasoline station whose faded sign continued to promise tires and service no longer available. By 1943, rubber was restricted under federal conservation orders, and gasoline was rationed by coupon and mileage classification. The pumps stood idle most days, their hoses stiff with dust. Daniel carried the store key on a string beneath his shirt, less from fear of theft than from the comfort of constancy in a time when so many objects had become conditional. Inside, the store smelled of flour dust, dry wood, and the faint residue of kerosene from the heater that had been used sparingly through the winter. A metal fan mounted in the rear window pushed warm air in a slow, ineffective circle. The soda cooler in the corner clicked on and off, its labor audible and disproportionate to its results. Daniel unlocked the cash box, counted the change against the previous night's figures, and placed the ration ledger on the counter before attending to anything else. He kept the ledger wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, a practical defense against dust and sun, though over time the care had taken on additional meaning. The book was thick, dark-backed, its edges worn from years of use that predated the war. Its ruled pages had been repurposed to meet federal requirements, columns added by hand and headings stamped to track dates, item classifications, coupon serials, and weekly totals. It was an older object pressed into newer service, a private book made to answer public demands. Rationing had arrived incrementally. First came notices posted in the post office and courthouse, urging conservation and equal sacrifice. Then radio announcements, broadcast from distant studios and repeated in the barber shop, describing production targets and supply priorities that required explanation before they could be understood. After that came the ration books themselves, distributed through the schoolhouse by county staff working from printed directives. Families received them with instructions to guard them like legal documents. Without the correct stamps and coupons, certain purchases were prohibited. Sugar came first, followed by gasoline and tires, then meats, fats, and processed foods. The language emphasized fairness and necessity. In practice, it translated into clerical precision. By 9 o'clock, customers arrived in predictable intervals that defined the store's rhythm. Mrs. Aguilar, who lived near the dry wash at the edge of town, bought flour and dried beans, her ration book folded inside a handkerchief. Mr. Pike, the mail carrier, asked again about gasoline coupons, despite knowing his classification limited his allotment. The question served as acknowledgement of a former abundance. A young woman balancing an infant purchased canned fruit and glanced briefly at the empty shelf where coffee had once stood before looking away. Daniel handled each transaction without haste. He tore coupons cleanly, logged booklet numbers, entered item codes, and calculated totals in a hand practiced enough to avoid erasures. The routine allowed little room for error and none for interpretation. Beyond the ration ledger, the store maintained inventory sheets, payroll records, and delivery receipts, documents required by the company and subject to inspection by visiting representatives or, less often, by county authorities. The ledger answered to a different authority, but in a town this small, distinctions blurred. Company supply schedules and federal allotments converged at the same counter. Daniel tried to think of his work as arithmetic rather than judgment, though the expressions of those across from him made the separation increasingly difficult to sustain. Near midday, when the street outside emptied and even the dogs retreated to shade, Daniel was recording a completed sale when a figure in the previous week's column caught his attention. The total was lower than expected by a narrow margin, subtle enough to escape notice without familiarity. He recognized his own handwriting and the pattern of addition he habitually used. The discrepancy suggested a missing carry, small, clean, and seemingly original. He closed the ledger, his hand flattening the cover, then opened it again. The ink showed no sign of disturbance. Mrs. Aguilar waited patiently at the counter. Daniel completed the transaction and watched her leave, the delayed bell sounding behind her. Through the afternoon, the ledger continued to draw his eye. He checked his sums more than once, darkening numbers where he rewrote them. The irregularities appeared in the same categories, reducing totals by modest amounts that accumulated only at the margins. No one else handled the book during business hours. It remained within his reach. The store was locked at night, but access was not impossible. Delivery drivers, law enforcement officers, and occasional company representatives moved through the space with assumed familiarity. Daniel knew the names printed on memoranda, but not the hands that might adjust figures. After closing, he stayed in the dim store and reviewed the past month's entries page by page. Comparing coupon counts to recorded totals, he found the same quiet adjustments recurring. They did not announce themselves as errors. Instead, they aligned the book with expectations formed elsewhere. When he wrapped the ledger again and tied the twine, the gesture felt provisional. Walking home beneath a sky already sharpening with stars, Daniel heard a radio voice through an open window listing production figures and urging continued restraint. He understood then that the ledger had ceased to be a neutral instrument. It had become a question placed in his keeping, one that routine alone could no longer answer. After the day he first registered the altered figures, Daniel found he could no longer enter the store without immediate awareness of the ledger's presence. It lay exactly where he had left it, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, unchanged in position or appearance. Yet it asserted itself before the shelves, before the till, before the light switch. He continued to unlock the door in the same order, to sweep dust from the threshold and raise the shades, but the familiarity of these actions no longer offered ease. Routine sharpened his attention instead, stripping away comfort and leaving only function. He began arriving earlier, sometimes while the sky remained colorless and the town not yet fully awake. At that hour, the store shed its public character and reduced itself to measures and surfaces. Daniel unwrapped the ledger and checked the previous day's entries line by line, recalculating totals in his head and occasionally on scrap paper. The figures he had entered himself carried the cadence of his habits. The others did not feel foreign so much as nearly correct, adjusted by someone who understood rationing categories, weekly ceilings, and the margins inspectors tolerated before asking questions. The precision suggested familiarity, not only with arithmetic, but with oversight. Company memoranda arrived without fixed schedule, printed on thin stock that smelled faintly of ink and handling. Delivered with the rest of the mail and addressed generically to the store, they spoke in repeated phrases about efficiency, cooperation, and the necessity of keeping supply lines uninterrupted under wartime conditions. One notice referred to acceptable losses attributed to transport delays, spoilage, or handling discrepancies, adding that central accounting would make adjustments as required. The language avoided detail while asserting authority, substituting reassurance for explanation. Daniel folded the memo and placed it between pages of the ledger, marking the location deliberately. He did not take it as proof, but he returned to the word acceptable with increasing frequency. As his focus narrowed, changes in the town's daily patterns became more visible. Mrs. Aguilar stopped buying sugar altogether, conserving her coupons in case she could exchange them with relatives in a neighboring community, a practice officially discouraged but widely understood. Mr. Pike began walking portions of his route, leaving the mail truck idle behind the post office to preserve gasoline. A mechanic who once lingered near the counter now entered only when necessary and often left without a purchase. No one complained to Daniel, yet the cumulative effect registered as a collective lowering of expectation, a recalibration undertaken without discussion. One afternoon, while Daniel stacked canned goods, Thomas, the boy often sent on errands because his father worked extended shifts at the copper mine, lingered near the counter. He examined labels without purpose and then asked whether more meat would arrive the following week. Daniel answered that he did not know, which was accurate within the limits of what he was told. The boy accepted the reply and left without buying anything. The exchange remained with Daniel longer than it should have, its weight out of proportion to its brevity. By midweek, Daniel began keeping his own notes. He used a small notebook once reserved for household lists, recording shipment quantities as crates were opened and comparing them with the figures printed on invoices. He worked quietly and methodically, never in front of customers, and never left the notebook in the store overnight. The discrepancies aligned closely with those he had observed in the ledger, consistent in direction, modest in scale. Their effect was to make shortages appear anticipated rather than actual, smoothing the transition between what arrived and what was reported. When the company truck arrived late on Thursday, its engine announced itself well before it reached the store, raising a plume of dust that settled slowly across the road. The driver, familiar by sight but not by name, unloaded the crates with minimal conversation. He signed a receipt quickly, avoided the counter, and declined the customary exchange that once accompanied delivery. When Daniel opened the crates, the reduced quantities were evident. The ledger, already aligned to lower totals, rendered the difference unremarkable on paper. That night, Daniel slept poorly. The house remained quiet, broken only by his sister's movements and the occasional sound of a vehicle passing on the highway. He thought of the mine, the road, and distant offices where figures were consolidated and returned as directives. He considered his own position, defined largely by invisibility, and recognized how efficiently that invisibility produced compliance. The following Monday, the regional representative arrived without notice. He was neatly dressed despite the heat, his appearance suggesting transit rather than residence. He asked routine questions and requested the ledger, turning its pages quickly and pausing only to confirm internal consistency. He remarked that the store's reports showed admirable regularity and that such compliance reflected well on management. When Daniel mentioned, carefully, that he had noticed minor differences between shipments and recorded allocations, the representative listened with an expression of patient acknowledgement rather than inquiry. He replied that wartime distribution required flexibility, that local variation was unavoidable, and that the company relied on clerks to keep records aligned with official guidance. The statement carried no explicit threat, yet its meaning was unmistakable. After the representative left, Daniel remained behind the counter with the ledger open before him. The book no longer functioned as a passive record. It presented a choice between reproducing figures that satisfied external expectations and documenting what passed through his hands. By the end of the week, he understood that observation alone was no longer neutral. Each entry now implied comparison, and the space in which his role existed narrowed accordingly. The ledger lay open, its ruled pages waiting, and Daniel recognized that writing itself had become inseparable from the question of whose reality he was meant to preserve. The week in which Daniel decided to act differed from the others only in the degree of attention he brought to it. The heat held steady, mornings briefly tolerable before the sun asserted itself, and the store continued to open and close according to the same posted hours. What changed was his awareness of each small action, as if he were already preserving them against erasure. He noticed how quickly his pencil shortened from recalculations that once required no second glance, and he measured the bell's delayed ring as an interval in which someone waited outside, paused on a decision whose weight now exceeded the transaction itself. On Tuesday morning, Eleanor Hart entered earlier than usual. She taught English at the high school and was known for carrying folded newspapers weeks after publication, articles lightly marked in the margins. She purchased canned milk and then asked, carefully, in the neutral tone of someone accustomed to discussion rather than argument, whether the store had received less sugar that month or whether she was miscounting her coupons. Daniel replied that the shipment had been smaller, a statement supported by the invoices in his notebook. She accepted this without comment, and then remarked that she had been encouraging her students to keep journals, to write down what they observed before explanations arrived from elsewhere. The remark was not directed at Daniel, yet it remained with him after she left, a parallel drawn quietly and without insistence. That afternoon, he compared his private notebook to the official paperwork once more. By then, the pattern required no effort to confirm. The discrepancies were regular, limited, and internally consistent. They reduced reported availability just enough to align with predetermined distributions. The ledger on the counter, with its neat columns and balanced totals, presented an account of the store's operations that depended on accepting the company's framing as authoritative. Daniel understood that by continuing to write in it without qualification, he was helping convert that framing into record. The regional representative returned on Thursday and made no pretense of brevity. He asked Daniel to sit with him at the small desk in the back of the store, where the fan's reach barely extended and the air remained heavy. He spoke of efficiency, of pressure from higher offices, of the need to preserve stability in small communities by preventing visible disruption. He said shortages appeared more severe on paper than they felt in practice, and suggested that careful reporting was a form of service. The language required no assent, only compliance, and Daniel understood that agreement was not the object of the conversation. When the representative finished, Daniel opened the notebook he had brought and placed it on the desk. He showed the recorded shipment quantities, the invoice figures, and the dates on which differences occurred. He spoke without emphasis, neither accusing nor appealing, stating only that the ledger did not reflect what arrived or what was sold. If the company required adjusted figures, he said, such instructions should be issued in writing and attached to the records rather than introduced indirectly. He had rehearsed the statement once the previous night, not to perfect it, but to ensure it contained nothing beyond what he could document. The representative did not take the notebook. He leaned back slightly, regarding Daniel with an expression that combined fatigue and appraisal. He said Daniel was exceeding the scope of his position, that wartime administration depended on trust, and that insisting on formal objection could be interpreted as resistance rather than diligence. He added, evenly, that clerical positions were readily filled. The absence of hostility gave the words a sense of finality. Daniel felt the consequences settle with a clarity that surprised him. He thought of his sister's careful household accounting, of men walking toward the mine before dawn, of Thomas lingering at the counter with nothing to buy. He also thought of the ledger, waiting on the counter to be opened again. He told the representative he would submit a written note with a next weekly report, documenting the discrepancies observed. He did not argue or qualify the intention. The room seemed quieter after he spoke, as if the decision had reduced uncertainty rather than increased it. The days that followed passed with unusual smoothness. No shipments arrived beyond those already scheduled. No new memoranda appeared in the mail. Daniel continued his work, recording each sale accurately and leaving the ledger otherwise unchanged. In the evenings, he drafted his statement with care, revising it until it described quantities, dates, and differences without reference to motive or consequence. He avoided the language of fairness or appeal and signed his name in the same hand he used for totals and receipts. On Monday morning, he attached the statement to the weekly report and placed it in the outgoing mail bag. The act was brief and unremarkable. Once done, it could not be amended or withdrawn. Daniel returned to the counter and opened the ledger. For the rest of the day, he worked as he always had, answering questions, tearing coupons, filling lines. Nothing in the town responded. The heat remained. The sky did not change. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to him personally. It stated that due to operational restructuring, his position would be terminated at the end of the week. It made no reference to the statement he had submitted and included a brief assurance that the decision did not reflect on his performance. Daniel folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. He finished the day's work, locked the door, and walked home beneath the same stars that had marked his route for years. That night, he noticed the absence of the fear he had anticipated. There was unease and a practical pressure of uncertainty, but beneath them lay a steadiness that had not been present before. The decision had been made, the figures recorded without adjustment, his name placed beneath words that would not be altered by his hand. Whatever followed would follow. The ledger no longer asked him to choose. Daniel worked his remaining days as he had worked all the others. He unlocked the door at the posted hour, swept dust from the threshold, and placed the ledger on the counter before attending to anything else. The letter notifying him of his termination stayed folded in his pocket, its presence constant and requiring no review. No company official arrived to oversee the transition, and no notice was posted for the town to read. In a place accustomed to adjustments made elsewhere, departures often occurred without formal acknowledgement. News of the change circulated quietly. Mrs. Aguilar asked who would be behind the counter the following week, and Daniel replied that he had not been told. Mr. Pike lingered longer than usual while delivering the mail, then offered a brief nod that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. Eleanor Hart came in to collect the notebooks ordered for her students and remarked that she hoped Daniel would continue to write things down wherever he found himself next. None of them mentioned the ledger, and none needed to. The understanding passed without being named. The new clerk arrived late on Friday afternoon, younger than Daniel and still marked by travel dust. He was courteous and attentive, asking where supplies were kept and how records were maintained. Daniel showed him the shelves, the lockbox, and the established order of the counter. He demonstrated how to tier coupons cleanly, how to align entries within ruled columns, and how to total each page so the sums balanced at a glance. When they reached the ledger, Daniel explained its structure and the importance of legibility and consistency. He offered no cautions beyond what the position formally required. The book passed from one set of hands to another without resistance or remark. On his final evening, Daniel closed the store alone. He counted the till, turned the sign, and listened to the bell complete its delayed ring as the door settled into place. Before wrapping the ledger, he paused with his hand on its cover. The pages inside were filled, orderly, unremarkable in appearance. His written statement had already been absorbed into files beyond his reach, its reception unknown and unlikely to be reported back to him. He tied the twine and set the ledger where it belonged. He walked home as the heat eased slowly from the ground, the sky broad and clear, the stars appearing with their usual regularity. At the house, his sister listened as he explained what had occurred. Her response was measured and practical. They discussed savings, how long they might last, neighbors who could offer work, and the possibility of employment at the mine if necessary. The conversation followed the logic of necessity rather than grievance. When it ended, Daniel recognized that he was no longer bracing himself against unspoken tension. In the days that followed, time loosened its structure. Without the store's schedule, his mornings stretched. He repaired a fence for a neighbor, carried water, and walked farther than usual while the air remained cool. Passing the store one afternoon, he saw the new clerk behind the counter, bent toward the ledger in the same posture Daniel himself had once held. The sight produced a brief tightening that resolved without effort. What struck him most was the absence of pressure he had grown accustomed to bearing. The continual adjustment between what he observed and what he was required to record was no longer his responsibility. He continued to think about the town, the shortages, and the accounting that shaped them, but the thoughts no longer pressed inward. He could recall the moment he chose to submit his statement and the act of signing his name without discomfort. The memory demanded no justification. One evening, Thomas ran past him in the street, intent on something unseen. Daniel watched the boy disappear between houses and felt a brief, unremarkable hope unrelated to outcomes or systems. He understood his action had not altered the authority of the ledger or the reach of the company. The store remained open, and the war continued to impose its arithmetic. But within the limited scope of his own life, something had settled into place. As night fell, Daniel sat on the porch and listened to the distant road. The desert held its heat and released it slowly, as it always had. He did not know what work would come next, or how long certainty could coexist with uncertainty. He knew only that the numbers he no longer wrote could no longer be used to quiet him. In a period when decisions were made far from where their effects were felt, that small resolution was sufficient. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.